A map from 1513 shows a continent not found for another 300 years. This single piece of parchment challenges the official story of human discovery. By the end of this journey, you will see the entire timeline of exploration in a startling new light. We will investigate coastlines drawn centuries too early and ask who really charted the world first. How did medieval cartographers possess knowledge that seems impossible? This is not just about old maps. It is about uncovering a hidden network of ancient voyages that could rewrite history itself. What does it mean when the evidence contradicts the story we all know? That map from 1513 is not just an old artifact, it is an anomaly. And to understand why it is so deeply unsettling, we must first define what that word truly means in this context. An anomalous map is not simply a drawing with a few mistakes. Every map from history has inaccuracies. An anomaly is something far more profound. It is a document that possesses precise, verifiable knowledge its creators, according to the history we accept, should have had absolutely no way of knowing. Imagine, if you will, finding a detailed blueprint for a jet engine inside a notebook belonging to Leonardo da Vinci. The object itself does not belong. It breaks the timeline. That is the essence of a cartographic anomaly. These are maps that show coastlines, islands, or entire continents centuries before their official discovery. The land is not drawn as a guess or a mythical place. It is rendered with a specificity that speaks of first-hand observation, or at the very least, information passed from someone who had been there. So where did this knowledge come from? The possibilities are as intriguing as they are controversial. Could it be a fragment of wisdom preserved from a much older, advanced civilization that was lost to time? Might it be evidence of secretive, state-sponsored voyages whose records were deliberately purged from history to protect trade routes or political power? Or perhaps it points to a vast, interconnected network of ancient explorers, merchants, and sailors exchanging stories and sketches across thousands of miles, a whispering chain of geographic truth that mainstream history has simply overlooked. By defining an anomaly in this way, we shift from looking at curious old drawings to investigating genuine historical puzzles. These maps are not errors. They are evidence, and with that lens focused, we can turn to the first and most iconic piece of evidence in this global mystery, a map that did not just hint at unknown lands, but placed a lost continent squarely on the page for all to see. That single piece of parchment from 1513 has a name, the Piri Reis map, and it remains one of the most debated artifacts in the history of cartography. Crafted by the Ottoman admiral and cartographer Piri Reis, this surviving fragment is a beautiful, bewildering work. It clearly shows the western coasts of Africa and Europe and the eastern coastline of South America, rendered with an accuracy that feels almost premature for its time. But the true controversy lies farther south. Below the tip of South America, the map depicts a landmass, a long, curling coastline that many researchers argue is a shockingly accurate representation of Queen Maud Land in Antarctica. This is the heart of the anomaly. This continent was not officially sighted by European explorers for another 300 years in 1820. Even more perplexing, the coastline on the Piri Reis map is shown free of its immense, mile-thick ice cap, a condition that geological evidence suggests last existed thousands of years ago. So how did a 16th-century admiral in Constantinople have access to such information? Piri Reis provided a clue in his own notes. He wrote that he was not the original author of this geographic knowledge, but rather a compiler. He stated he used about 20 older source maps and charts, some of which dated back to the time of Alexander the Great, around the 4th century BCE. This admission is crucial. It suggests he was piecing together a mosaic from a much older, now vanished library of global exploration. The debate among modern scholars is fierce. Skeptics offer a compelling alternative, proposing that the mysterious southern land is not Antarctica at all, but a distorted, elongated version of Patagonia, perhaps influenced by speculative geography or mythical southern continents that were common on maps of the era. Yet for others, the specific contours and placement remain too coincidental to dismiss. Whether it shows a lost Antarctic coastline or a misunderstood fragment of South America, the Piri Reis map undeniably points to a deeper truth. It is a palimpsest, a later document written over layers of erased, ancient knowledge. It tells us that the world of 1513 was still consulting charts from antiquity, charts that may have contained secrets of the globe that history later forgot. This map does not stand alone as a curiosity. It is the first piece of a much larger puzzle, a whisper from an age of explorers whose names we no longer remember, setting the stage for even older and more mysterious charts to come. The controversy of the Piri Reis map is rooted in a southern landmass, but our next anomaly shifts the focus dramatically to the north. A document known as the Vinland map surfaced in the 1950s, a manuscript that sent shockwaves through the academic world. It is dated to around 1440, a full 5 decades before Columbus's famous voyage. On its worn parchment, alongside recognizable outlines of Europe and Africa, it shows a large, jagged island labeled Greenland. And to the west of Greenland, separated by a narrow sea, lies a smaller, bulbous landmass inscribed with the words Vinland Insula. This name, Vinland, is not a cartographer's invention. It comes directly from the Norse sagas, ancient stories that tell of Leif Eriksson's journey to a fertile land he called Vinland around the year 1000. If this map was truly drawn in the 15th century, it would be the first known depiction of any part of the American continents in European cartography, a silent, inked testament to a voyage that predated Columbus by half a millennium. The story of the map itself reads like a historical thriller. It appeared without a clear provenance, a mysterious artifact purchased by a wealthy donor and presented to Yale University. Almost immediately, experts began a forensic investigation that continues to this day. The debate hinges on the very substance of the map, the chemical composition of its ink. Initial studies suggested the ink contained a modern compound, anatase, which would point squarely to a 20th century forgery. Yet later analyses raised new questions, with some researchers arguing the compound could have formed naturally over centuries. The parchment itself has been carbon dated to the correct period, but that only confirms the age of the material, not the drawing upon it. This back and forth has created one of the greatest academic scandals in modern history, a battle of laboratories and interpretations where the line between groundbreaking discovery and elaborate hoax remains blurred. But here is where the map, regardless of its authenticity, forces a crucial confrontation. Just north of the island labeled Vinland Insula, on the very real coast of Newfoundland, Canada, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a Norse settlement at a place called Elance Ox Meadows. The site, with its distinct Viking-style structures and artifacts, provides irrefutable physical proof that Norse explorers did indeed reach North America around the year 1000, just as their sagas claimed. So the Vinland map, even if it is a clever fake, serves a profound purpose. It is a mirror held up to our historical narrative. It asks why such a monumental achievement, the Norse contact with the Americas, remained a footnote for so long. It challenges us to explain how this knowledge might have been preserved, lost, or perhaps deliberately ignored in the centuries that followed. The map's greatest power may not be in proving its own age, but in pointing our attention to the solid ground of Elance Ox Meadows and then eastward, across the Atlantic, to the culture that produced those explorers. For if the Norse knew of these lands, could that knowledge have traveled further into the hands of other mapmakers in other parts of the world, waiting to be rediscovered on another piece of ancient parchment? While the authenticity of the Vinland map remains locked in debate, no such ambiguity clouds the next artifact in our collection. The Cantino Planisphere is a confirmed masterpiece of espionage and artistry, a breathtaking snapshot of the world as Europe understood it at the very dawn of the 16th century. Created by an unknown Portuguese cartographer and smuggled to Italy in 1502 by an agent named Alberto Cantino, this map was a state secret stolen for a rival duke. Its primary purpose was to show the triumphant routes of Portuguese explorers like Vasco da Gama, meticulously charting the African coastline and the sea path to India that had shattered old trade monopolies. This was the cutting edge of known geography, a testament to Portugal's daring naval supremacy. Yet it is the map's depiction of the New World that holds a quieter, more puzzling secret. On the western edge of the parchment, a long, graceful arc of land is clearly labeled Terra del Rei de Portugal, the land of the King of Portugal. We know this today as Brazil. According to official records, the Portuguese commander Pedro Álvares Cabral first sighted this coast in April of 1500, a landfall often described as an accidental discovery during a storm. The Cantino Planisphere was completed just 2 years later. The detail presented is not a vague, speculative blob. The map shows the prominent eastern bulge of Brazil with a startlingly accurate contour, including major features like the São Francisco River estuary and the Bay of All Saints. This presents a fascinating logistical puzzle. How could such a precise and confident rendering be produced so quickly? The voyage from Portugal to Brazil and back took the better part of a year. This leaves a very narrow window for explorers to survey the coast, return home, and for that new data to be processed by royal cartographers into a finished work of such elegance and detail. The speed implies an expeditionary effort of remarkable focus and efficiency immediately following Cabral's return. But another, more provocative possibility exists. What if the map's accuracy stems not from rapid follow-up, but from prior knowledge? Some historians suggest Cabral's voyage was not an accident of weather, but a deliberate mission to claim a territory whose general location was already known from earlier, unrecorded voyages or from intelligence gathered from other Atlantic sailors. The map deepens this mystery with a small inscription south of Brazil, pointing to a land of the True Cross, a possible reference to an even earlier sighting. The Cantino Planisphere, therefore, stands at a crossroads. It is the first unambiguous, dated map to show a part of the American continents, and it represents the official, state-sanctioned knowledge of its era. But in its polished certainty, it whispers of a foundation laid not in 2 frantic years, but perhaps over decades or even longer. It forces us to ask what the Portuguese crown truly knew, and when they knew it, setting the stage for us to look back to a time long before Portugal's golden age, to maps that suggest this knowledge was not being discovered, but rediscovered. The polished certainty of the Cantino Planisphere hints at knowledge gathered over time, but to find its possible source, we must sail back into a much foggier era of exploration. In the late 1380s, a full century before Columbus would set sail, a Venetian manuscript known as the Zeno map presented a vision of the North Atlantic that is equal parts confusion and revelation. Attributed to the brothers Niccolo and Antonio Zeno, this document claims to chart voyages they or their ancestors undertook in the 1390s. What it shows is a world where geography and mythology are inseparably tangled. Alongside the recognizable shapes of Iceland and Greenland, the map places phantom islands with names like Friesland, a place that would stubbornly appear on navigational charts for centuries despite never existing. But nestled among these cartographic ghosts are lands with far more intriguing names. To the west of Greenland, the map labels a substantial territory Estetiland, a name many researchers associate with Labrador or Newfoundland. Even further south lies a place called Drogeo, which some interpretations suggest could be a crude, early attempt to represent the northeastern coastline of North America itself. The profound anomaly here is not one of precise accuracy, but of premature concept. The Zeno map is notoriously distorted, a patchwork of sailors' yarns, half-remembered reports, and perhaps outright invention. Yet its very existence in the late 14th century places a radical idea onto parchment, the idea that there were significant lands across the Atlantic Ocean, waiting beyond the horizon. This was not a map for navigation, but a repository of rumor and report. It suggests that in the bustling ports of Venice, Genoa, and beyond, stories were circulating among sailors and merchants. Tales of distant forests, unfamiliar peoples, and strange fishing grounds to the far west were being exchanged, whispered, and eventually inked onto charts. Where did these stories originate? The most likely conduit is the Norse, whose settlements in Greenland lasted for centuries, and whose voyages to Vinland were a living, if fading, memory in the North Atlantic. The Zeno narrative even mentions meeting a fisherman who claimed to have returned from these western lands, a story that echoes the saga of Leif Erikson. This map, therefore, occupies a crucial middle ground. It stands as a European document that captures, however imperfectly, the fading echo of earlier transatlantic contact. It blurs the line between legend and reconnaissance, showing us that the New World was not a sudden shock in 1492, but a slow dawning in the European imagination, built upon layers of forgotten journeys and second-hand accounts. The Zeno map prepares us for a pivotal shift in perspective. If such knowledge was filtering into Europe from northern sources, what might have been known in other parts of the world, in civilizations with their own long traditions of seafaring and star navigation? This question pulls our gaze away from the Atlantic and eastward, toward a culture whose legendary voyages would produce charts of such staggering scope that they defy all conventional timelines of exploration. While European cartographers were piecing together rumors of Western lands, a masterpiece of global perspective was being completed in the heart of East Asia. The Kangnido map, crafted in Korea in 1402, presents a world view so expansive it feels centuries ahead of its time. This is not a chart of local seas or regional trade routes. It is an ambitious attempt to depict the entire known world, from Korea and Japan in the east, across the vastness of Asia and the Middle East, all the way to the western edges of Europe and the full, unmistakable shape of the African continent. And it is here, in its rendering of Africa, that the map delivers its most profound shock. The continent is shown with a southern coastline that curves sharply eastward, suggesting an awareness that Africa had a bottom, a southern tip that could be sailed around. This was drawn 85 years before the Portuguese explorer Bartolomeu Dias would officially round the Cape of Good Hope in 1487. So how did a group of scholars in a Korean court possess such a seemingly prescient geographic insight? The Kangnido map provides its own answer, not through mystery but through acknowledgement. Its creators wrote that it was a synthesis, a compilation of older Chinese and Islamic maps brought together through the diplomatic and scholarly exchanges of the era. This is the critical clue. The knowledge did not originate in Korea. It flowed there along the ancient highways of information, the Silk Road, and the bustling maritime trade networks of the Indian Ocean. For centuries, Arab and Persian merchants had been sailing down the eastern coast of Africa, possibly even rounding its tip in the opposite direction, from the Indian Ocean into the Atlantic. Their navigational charts and travel accounts, filled with practical knowledge of coastlines and currents, gradually filtered north and east, Chinese explorers, most famously the vast treasure fleets of Admiral Zheng He that began their voyages just a few years after this map was made, were also active in these waters, gathering their own data. The Kangnido map is therefore a snapshot of a moment when this accumulated wisdom from multiple civilizations converged. It shatters the persistent myth that the world was discovered in a linear, European-led sequence. Instead, it reveals a parallel timeline of exploration and understanding, a sophisticated geospatial awareness that was thriving in Asia while Europe was still emerging from the medieval period. This map does not show lands unknown to its makers. It shows a connected world where the shape of Africa was not a secret to be discovered by one nation, but a piece of information that had been circulating among scholars and sailors across half the globe for generations. It forces a humbling realization. The so-called Age of Discovery was not the beginning of global knowledge, but often the late arrival of one part of the world to insights long held by others. This interconnected flow of information sets the stage for an even more astonishing possibility. If knowledge of Africa's shape could traverse continents, what other geographic secrets might have been shared, and could that explain how the coast of a distant, ice-locked continent found its way onto a map drawn in Constantinople? The Kangnido map reveals a world already connected by trade and scholarship, but this flow of information was not universal. To truly grasp the revolutionary nature of the maps we have seen, we must first understand the official, academic view of the world they so boldly contradicted. For centuries in Europe, the ultimate authority on geography was not a living explorer, but a scholar who had lived over 1,000 years earlier. Claudius Ptolemy, an astronomer and geographer in 2nd century Alexandria, compiled a work called the Geographia. It was a mathematical framework for mapping the world, complete with coordinates for thousands of places. When this text was rediscovered and translated during the Renaissance, it was treated not as an ancient theory, but as gospel truth. Maps based on Ptolemy's calculations became the standard in universities and royal courts. Yet these prestigious charts were profoundly, systematically wrong. They depicted the Indian Ocean as a landlocked sea with a great southern continent connecting Africa to Asia, making a voyage to India by sea impossible. They showed Sri Lanka as a landmass nearly the size of India itself. Most significantly, they contained no hint of the Americas or the vast Pacific Ocean. The entire Western Hemisphere was simply absent, a blank space beyond Europe. When new reports from sailors began to trickle in, the academic response was often to dismiss them or, more curiously, to try and force these new discoveries into Ptolemy's ancient and flawed model. It was a constant battle to make reality fit the map rather than the map fit reality. This makes the accuracy of the Portolan charts, those practical sailing maps used by Mediterranean mariners, utterly extraordinary. While scholars in libraries were copying Ptolemy's enclosed Indian Ocean, a Portolan chart from the 1300s might confidently show the African coastline curving southward, implying an open ocean route. This was not academic knowledge, it was lived experience etched onto vellum by hands that had felt the wind and measured the stars. The stark tension here is illuminating. It suggests that for much of history there were two parallel streams of geographic understanding. One was the official, scholarly tradition, passed down in books and often stubbornly disconnected from the changing world. The other was the secretive, practical knowledge of merchants, fishermen, and explorers, knowledge that was traded in port taverns and guarded in captains' logbooks. This sailor's knowledge was dynamic, empirical, and frequently far more accurate. It was also fragile, easily lost if a ship sank or a trade route faded. So when we look at a map like the Cantino Planisphere or the Kangnido map, we are not just looking at a drawing. We are seeing a moment when this guarded, practical knowledge finally broke through and was committed to parchment, creating a permanent record that dared to contradict a millennium of academic dogma. This silent rebellion on the page leads us directly to the tools that made such accurate charting possible, to a family of maps defined not by their conformity to ancient texts, but by their breathtaking fidelity to the coastline itself. The stark contrast between scholarly maps and sailors' charts reveals a hidden world of maritime knowledge. This brings us to the Portolan charts, masterpieces of navigation that defy simple explanation. Emerging suddenly in the late 13th century, these are not maps of continents or kingdoms, but intensely practical guides for a pilot at sea. They focus with laser precision on coastlines, depicting every bay, headland, and river mouth of the Mediterranean and Black Seas with an accuracy that feels almost modern. What makes them truly anomalous is their origin. They appear in the historical record fully formed, a sophisticated cartographic technology without any clear, clumsy predecessors. One moment, maps are symbolic diagrams, the next, these breathtakingly accurate coastal portraits exist. They are covered in a spiderweb of lines radiating from central points, called room lines, which allowed a navigator to plot a constant bearing across open water. The charts also include detailed written notes on ports, hazards, and sailing distances, information that could only come from countless voyages and meticulous record-keeping. A chart like the dulcet Portolan of 1339 does not stop at the familiar Mediterranean. It begins to tentatively extend its lines down the Atlantic coast of Africa, a coastline that, according to the official timeline, was still largely unexplored by European sailors at that time. So where did this advanced system come from? The suddenness and sophistication of the Portolans have fueled a compelling theory. They may not be an invention of the medieval period, but a rediscovery. Scholars suggest they could be based on far older sources, perhaps the detailed sailing logs or peripli from ancient Roman or Greek mariners. This accumulated, practical knowledge might have been preserved and refined over centuries by Arab or Jewish cartographers in the vibrant trading centers of the Mediterranean, only to re-enter European awareness in the 13th century. These charts are the silent, technical backbone of the coming age of exploration. They represent a corpus of hands-on experience that existed parallel to the official record, a testament to generations of unnamed sailors who measured the world not with theory, but with rope, compass, and astrolabe. They hint at a continuity of seafaring science, a thread of geographic truth that was nearly lost, only to resurface and guide the ships that would ultimately connect the globe. Portolan charts gave sailors the tools to navigate known coasts, but what happens when a mapmaker tries to sketch the entire unknown world? In 1507, a German cartographer named Martin Waldseemüller published a work of breathtaking audacity. His map did not just add new lands to the edges of an old picture. It tore the old picture down and built a new one from the ground up. Its most famous innovation is right there in the southern continent's label, the name America, placed in honor of the explorer Amerigo Vespucci. But that historic naming is almost a distraction from the map's truly revolutionary feature. For the first time on a printed map, Waldseemüller depicted the Pacific Ocean as a vast, empty expanse of water separating Asia from the newly drawn western continents. This was published a full 6 years before the Spanish explorer Vasco Núñez de Balboa would famously sight the Pacific from a peak in Panama in 1513. So how could Waldseemüller possibly know? He was a scholar, not a sailor, working in a landlocked town in modern-day France. His source was not secret charts, but the flood of new, often contradictory, reports coming back from across the Atlantic. He studied the accounts of Vespucci, which described lands that were clearly not Asia, and he likely interpreted older classical texts that speculated about a great ocean west of Europe. Waldseemüller was doing something radical. He was taking fragmented, second-hand data and theoretical ideas and synthesizing them into a coherent and ultimately correct new model of the planet. He even presented this new world in a revolutionary way, using a cordiform or heart-shaped projection, an innovative attempt to represent a spherical Earth on a flat sheet. This map is a different kind of anomaly. It is not a relic of forgotten knowledge, but a lightning-fast intellectual leap. It represents the precise moment when the medieval paradigm, the world of Ptolemy and enclosed seas, finally shattered under the weight of new evidence. Within a single generation, the map of the human world had been fundamentally and permanently altered. Waldseemüller's work marks a critical transition, the point where an anomalous idea, born from a mix of fresh reports and old whispers, was published with such confidence that it stopped being a theory and started becoming accepted fact. It shows us that once the door to new knowledge is pushed open, even just a crack, the entire structure of understanding can change with astonishing speed. And if a scholar in 1507 could correctly deduce the existence of a vast ocean he had never seen, based on the clues available to him, it forces us to wonder what other global truths might have been deduced or remembered in earlier ages, waiting in plain sight on even older parchment. Waldseemüller's brilliant deduction marked a new era of mapmaking, one driven by synthesis and theory. Yet, even as cartography became more scientific, some maps continued to whisper of secrets that science had not yet uncovered. Nearly 230 years later, in 1737, a French geographer named Philippe Buach published a chart that would become a different kind of puzzle. His map of the southern regions did not claim to show known lands. Instead, it presented a bold hypothesis. Buach proposed that the rumored southern continent, Terra Australis, was not a single solid landmass. He drew it as two very large separate islands, divided by a frozen sea that stretched from the pole toward the southern tips of America and Africa. This was not copied from some ancient, mysterious source. It was a theoretical construction, an Enlightenment-era exercise in speculative geography. Buach was working from reports of where icebergs were sighted in the southern oceans, reasoning they must calve from great frozen rivers between landmasses. He was also influenced by a popular idea of the time, the concept of continental symmetry, which suggested landmasses in the northern hemisphere should be balanced by similar shapes in the south. On its own, this was simply an elegant, educated guess. The anomaly emerged much later in the 20th century. With the advent of seismic surveys and ice-penetrating radar, scientists finally mapped the bedrock of Antarctica beneath its miles-thick ice cap. They discovered the continent is, in a profound geological sense, two distinct entities. A vast mountain range, the Transantarctic Mountains, acts as a massive spine, dividing East Antarctica, a single ancient shield from West Antarctica, which is actually a complex archipelago of smaller landmasses buried under the ice. The central frozen sea that Buach drew aligns loosely with the location of this great dividing range and the deep basins between the land masses. How could an 18th century theorist, with no physical exploration of the continent, produce a map whose underlying premise so accidentally mirrors a deep geological truth confirmed only with modern technology? The Buach map demonstrates a fascinating possibility that theoretical cartography, when fueled by fragments of older sailors' lore or half-remembered reports, could sometimes stumble onto reality through a combination of logic and luck. It suggests that the whispers about the southern lands, whispers that may have informed maps like the Piri Reis centuries earlier, never fully disappeared. They simply changed form, moving from sailors' yarns to academic hypotheses, preserving a thin, almost invisible thread of speculative knowledge about the farthest reaches of the world. This map connects the enlightened guesswork of the 1700s back to the mysterious accuracy of far older charts, reminding us that the line between myth and premonition in mapmaking can be astonishingly faint. Laurence Fenet's world map from 1531 is a work of art that invites you to dream, but its beauty masks a profound geographic riddle. Crafted in the elegant heart shape popularized by Waldseemüller, this French mathematician's map presents a world that is both familiar and fantastically wrong. South America is clearly defined, but from its southern tip stretches a long, slender isthmus, a land bridge connecting it to an enormous continent labeled Terra Australis. This southern land is not a blank space. Ptolemy filled its interior with sketched mountain ranges and winding rivers, giving it the appearance of a real, surveyed territory. This is the core of its mystery. Why would a scholar working with the best information of his time not only insist on a southern continent but dare to illustrate its inland features with such specificity? Ptolemy was operating within the respected theory of continental symmetry, the idea that the northern lands must be balanced by southern ones to keep the world stable. He also had access to the exciting, often exaggerated reports filtering back from Portuguese voyages down the African coast and around the Indian Ocean. Tales from Marco Polo, centuries old, spoke of rich lands to the far south. Ptolemy took these fragments, theory, rumor, and scattered report, and wove them into a single, cohesive vision. His map, therefore, is a masterclass in educated guesswork. Yet that very act of informed conjecture forces a haunting question. What if some of those details were not purely theoretical? The slender land bridge is geographically impossible, but could it be a distorted memory of the Drake Passage, the stormy strait between South America and Antarctica, described by a sailor who survived its tempests but whose account was later lost? Could the mountains and rivers be a Chinese whisper, a garbled retelling of much older accounts from Polynesian navigators or Arab traders who may have glimpsed the icy coasts of a southern land? Ptolemy's map sits perfectly in the gray area that defines so many of these anomalies. It is not necessarily a record of secret knowledge, but it is a canvas upon which the whispers of real, unrecorded voyages may have been painted over with the brush of theory. It represents the Renaissance mind at work, desperately trying to make sense of a world that was suddenly, bewilderingly larger than any text had ever described. In its confident errors, it pushes us to listen more carefully to the silence between the lines of history, to wonder who else might have been navigating the roaring forties and frozen southern seas long before Ferdinand Magellan's expedition charted a global path. The Haji Ahmed map of 1559 emerges from this same world of synthesis and secret archives, an Ottoman masterpiece that speaks in a confident, global language. Published in Venice but compiled by the Ottoman cartographer Haji Ahmed, this chart presents a world seen through a distinctly different lens. Its most immediate shock is its shape, an elegant elliptical projection that frames the continents within a graceful oval, a sophisticated mathematical choice far removed from the traditional rectangular charts of Europe. But the true revelation lies in its content. The western coastline of the Americas is rendered with a startling clarity, depicting the distinct, jagged profile of Alaska and the long, curling arc of the Aleutian Islands reaching toward Asia with an accuracy that seems to anticipate a Bering Land Bridge concept by centuries. This is not a vague suggestion of land to the west. It is a specific, intricate coastline that suggests the map's compiler had access to extraordinary source material. Like the Piri Reis map before it, the Haji Ahmed map appears to be a compilation, a grand mosaic pieced together from a library of charts that span traditions. It seamlessly blends the latest Portuguese and Spanish discoveries with the enduring geographic frameworks of Greek astronomers and Arab navigators. The Ottoman Empire, straddling Europe and Asia, was the perfect crossroads for this convergence. Its scholars in Constantinople had access to the maritime reports flowing in from the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic, while also preserving the classical knowledge of Ptolemy and the advanced practical sailing directions, or Ramani, of Arab seafarers. This map powerfully underscores that the pursuit of global knowledge was never a single civilization's race. It was a vast, multi-threaded conversation, a slow exchange of data across deserts and seas. Key nodes in this network were not just in Lisbon or Seville, but in Constantinople, Cairo, and Baghdad, where scholars curated and translated knowledge from every corner of the known world. The Haji Ahmed map is a testament to that custodial role. It preserves whispers that may have been lost elsewhere, presenting a vision of the Pacific Rim that feels informed by a deep, composite understanding. It complicates our tidy narrative by showing that the full shape of the world was being assembled from many different angles simultaneously, and that some of those angles offered glimpses of connections, like a chain of islands between continents, that official history would take much longer to formally acknowledge. The Haji Ahmed map shows a world assembled from many traditions, but the next anomaly brings us to a single, brilliant atlas born from direct experience. In 1542, a French hydrographer named Jean Rots presented King Henry VIII of England with a magnificent volume titled The Book of Hydrography. This was not a theoretical exercise. Rots had sailed extensively, and his maps of the coast of Brazil and the eastern shores of Canada are masterworks of observation, rendered with a crisp, confident clarity that feels almost modern. They show every inlet, every promontory with the eye of someone who had been there, or who had meticulously interviewed those who had. This precision is the very heart of the puzzle. Rots's atlas represents the official, state-of-the-art knowledge of the world just 50 years after Columbus's first voyage. And that is the staggering part, the sheer speed of it all. Consider the timeline for a moment. In 1492, the official European view held that only ocean lay west of Spain. Half a century later, a royal hydrographer could produce a detailed, accurate chart of a coastline thousands of miles long, on a continent whose very existence was unknown a lifetime earlier. This is not the slow, tentative shading in of a blank space. This is the rapid, confident tracing of a silhouette that had suddenly snapped into focus. How was such a feat of geographic assimilation possible? It implies an explosion of heroic exploration, which certainly occurred with ships from Portugal, Spain, France, and England all racing into the Atlantic. But the speed and accuracy of the resulting maps suggest something more. It feels less like discovering a new coastline for the first time, and more like systematically filling in the details of a coastline whose general outline was already whispered, already suspected. The navigators of the 1500s were not staring into a void. They were consulting Portolan charts and perhaps even older sailing directions that gave them a bearing, a hint of what to look for. Rots's own work hints at this. His maps are so good because they synthesize the latest first-hand reports, but those reports were guided by something. What foundational charts, now lost, did those early explorers like John Cabot or the Court-Real brothers carry with them as their baselines? Jean Rots's atlas marks a critical turning point in our story. It is the moment when the anomalous knowledge, the whispers and fragments, finally became the mainstream cartographic record. The mystery was no longer about whether these lands existed, but about how they could be charted so completely, so soon. This velocity of discovery forces us to pull the camera back for a wider view. If this much of the world could be accurately mapped in 50 years, what could have been accomplished by ancient civilizations with centuries of seafaring tradition? This question shifts our gaze from the Atlantic rush to the enduring mystery of a Pacific culture whose celestial navigators may have charted an ocean we are still struggling to fully understand. These maps present a puzzle, and the human mind instinctively seeks a pattern to solve it. When confronted with scattered evidence of impossible knowledge, one compelling idea emerges: the possibility of a single, lost source. This is the grand theory of a foundational civilization, an advanced seafaring culture that mapped the world in a distant, forgotten age. Figures like the historian Charles Hapgood championed this view, suggesting that a sophisticated global society, perhaps one we call Atlantis, possessed the skill to chart coastlines with precision millennia ago. According to this theory, the Great Library of Alexandria or other ancient repositories held these master charts. When those libraries were lost to fire and time, only fragments survived, copied and recopied by scribes who no longer understood their origin, eventually finding their way onto the parchments of medieval monks and Ottoman admirals. It is an elegant, sweeping answer. Another persistent myth points north to a legendary place called Hyperborea, described in some Greek texts as a perfect, ancient land beyond the north wind. While these concepts are firmly in the realm of speculative history, dismissed by mainstream archaeology for a lack of physical evidence, their enduring appeal is understandable. They offer a clean, singular explanation for a messy, global phenomenon. They transform a dozen disparate anomalies into pieces of one magnificent, shattered whole. Yet, this very desire for a neat solution is worth examining. It challenges us to ask if we are overlooking a more complex, but perhaps more realistic picture. Instead of a single lost fountain of knowledge, what if we are seeing the accumulated drips from many different springs? The persistence of these grand myths does not prove an ancient super-civilization, but it does underscore the profound mystery these maps represent. They push us to look beyond a simple timeline and consider a world where exploration was not a linear race, but a recurring, scattered, and often forgotten human endeavor, whose echoes somehow survived against all odds. The idea of a single lost source is powerfully simple, but history is rarely so tidy. A more complex, though still debated, framework offers a different answer: diffusionism. This is not the story of one forgotten superculture, but of many. It proposes a world where the great oceans were not impassable barriers, but highways occasionally traveled, where sporadic but real contact occurred between the old world and the new, not once, but many times over thousands of years. This theory shifts the narrative from a grand library burning to a slow, persistent trickle of information across the seas. Proponents of this view assemble a mosaic of curious evidence. They point to striking cultural parallels that seem to transcend coincidence, like the independent development of pyramid structures on both sides of the Atlantic, or eerily similar flood myths and creation stories found in widely separated cultures. They examine archaeological oddities such as alleged Roman coins found in American soil, or depictions of what appear to be New World plants like maize in ancient European art. And of course, they return to the maps, seeing them not as relics of Atlantis, but as the fragmented, distorted echoes of these real, if rare, transoceanic journeys. Imagine a Phoenician merchant vessel blown off course by an Atlantic storm, eventually making landfall on a strange, forested coast. The surviving crew, after a harrowing return journey, would bring back tales and perhaps a crude sketch of what they saw. That sketch might enter the royal archives of Tyre, be copied by a Greek scholar, later found by a Roman geographer, and centuries later, be referenced by an Arab cartographer in Alexandria. With each copying, details shift, names are lost, but the core shape of a distant coastline remains, a ghost in the parchment. This process could have happened from multiple directions. Could Chinese treasure ships, under the command of admirals like Zheng He, have ventured beyond their known Indian Ocean routes, perhaps even crossing the Pacific? Could Polynesian voyagers, the greatest open ocean navigators in human history, have reached South America on their vast double-hulled canoes, and could knowledge of that land have filtered back westward along their island networks? The famous Kon-Tiki expedition in the 1940s demonstrated the startling feasibility of such Pacific voyages using only ancient technology, a raft drifting on currents and winds. Diffusionism suggests our anomalous maps are the scattered receipts of these forgotten check-ins. They are not a unified global survey, but isolated data points preserved in a monastery here, a sultan's library there, surviving centuries of silence before being stumbled upon and compiled by a Renaissance mapmaker who no longer knew their true origin. This theory replaces the mystery of a single source with the mystery of a web, a fragile, global network of journeys whose threads were mostly broken, leaving only the most tantalizing knots behind in our historical record. That web of forgotten journeys offers a compelling narrative, but a crucial counterpoint demands our attention. For every map that seems to whisper of lost voyages, a skeptical historian points to the powerful human capacity for coincidence and educated conjecture. This perspective urges us to temper our wonder with rigorous scrutiny. It argues that we may be seeing patterns in the parchment where none exist, connecting dots across centuries with the benefit of hindsight. Take the most famous example, the supposed Antarctica on the Piri Reis map. From a skeptical viewpoint, that curling southern landmass is not a frozen continent without ice. It is far more likely a distorted, elongated version of Patagonia, the southern tip of South America, a coastline European sailors were just beginning to explore. A mapmaker working with fragmented and conflicting reports might easily have stretched and misplaced this new information, creating an accidental shape that later generations, armed with modern maps, misinterpret as a prophetic vision. This lens of skepticism extends to other marvels. The shockingly accurate shape of Africa on the 1402 Kangnido map loses some of its mystery when we remember the vibrant trade networks of the Indian Ocean. Arab and Persian merchants had been sailing those waters for centuries. It is entirely plausible, even likely, that some of these traders had rounded the Cape of Good Hope from the east, sailing into the Atlantic and back, their knowledge slowly filtering along the Silk Road to Chinese and Korean scholars. This was not secret intelligence, but open commercial geography, circulating through normal channels long before Portuguese caravels arrived. Similarly, the breathtaking speed with which coastlines like Brazil were charted after 1500 can be explained by the focused, frenetic energy of the age of discovery itself. Nations were pouring resources into exploration, sending out fleets with explicit orders to map and claim. A single accurate report from a skilled navigator about a river, mouth, or a bay could allow a brilliant cartographer back in Lisbon or Seville to extrapolate, using geometric principles and intuition, the likely curve of an entire coastline. These mapmakers were not passive copyists of ancient secrets. They were active, brilliant synthesizers, puzzle solvers of the highest order who could weave together sailors' logs, star charts, and rumors into a coherent and often startlingly correct whole. The skeptical argument is powerful and essential. It grounds us in Occam's razor, the principle that the simplest explanation, the one requiring the fewest assumptions, is often the correct one. It suggests we do not need to invoke lost civilizations, global prehistoric networks, or suppressed voyages to explain these maps. Human ingenuity, the slow accumulation of data through trade, exploration, and scholarly deduction, is a sufficient engine for the cartographic revolution we witness. This view champions the known actors of history, the Portuguese captains, the Arab astronomers, the Renaissance scholars, giving them full credit for their monumental achievements without requiring a shadowy prehistory. Yet, for all its logical appeal, this skeptical lens can sometimes feel like a blanket, thrown over the entire mystery to smooth out its lumps. It elegantly explains the general trends, the broad strokes of progress, but it can struggle with the specific, pinpoint accuracies, the details that feel less like guesswork and more like a trace. It accounts for the shape of Africa, but does it fully explain the precise rendering of the Aleutian island chain on a 1559 Ottoman map, a remote and treacherous archipelago? It allows for distorted coastlines, but can coincidence alone explain a southern continent drawn as two distinct landmasses, mirroring a geological truth beneath the ice, centuries before that ice could be penetrated? There remains, after all the rational analysis, a thin residue of mystery that the blanket of skepticism does not quite cover, a collection of details that continue to poke through, inviting us to look just a little deeper. The thin residue of mystery finds its perfect crystallization in a remarkable collection of charts from a single French port. In the bustling shipyards of Dieppe during the 1540s and 50s, a school of master cartographers produced a series of stunning world maps, lavishly decorated and filled with startling detail. Known collectively as the Dieppe maps, works like the Harleian and Desseliers charts present a world that is both familiar and fantastically expanded. Their most enduring puzzle lies in the southern hemisphere, where they depict a vast landmass hugging the bottom of the Indian Ocean. This continent is labeled Java la Grande, and its eastern coastline bears a provocative, if distorted, resemblance to the northern and western shores of Australia. This was drawn over 200 years before Captain James Cook would officially chart that continent's east coast in 1770. So what are we looking at? The skeptical interpretation is one of confusion, not clairvoyance. These French mapmakers, working from second-hand Portuguese and Spanish reports, likely received garbled accounts of the large islands of Southeast Asia, like Java and New Guinea. In trying to piece these fragments together, they may have accidentally created a speculative supercontinent, a misplaced amalgamation of real geography that only by chance echoes the shape of a land they never knew existed. It is a classic case of the map being a record of the rumor, not the reality. Yet the diffusionist perspective sees something far more intriguing in the ink. What if Java la Grande is not a mistake but a memory? Portuguese ships were aggressively probing the Indian Ocean and the Spice Islands in the early 1500s. It is entirely plausible that one of their caravels, blown far off course, sighted the barren western coast of Australia. Such a discovery would have been a state secret of immense value, closely guarded to protect future trade routes. The knowledge could have leaked to the well-connected chart makers in Dieppe, a major center for maritime trade and intelligence. An even more expansive theory looks further back, to the colossal treasure fleets of the Chinese Admiral Zheng He, whose 7 great voyages across the Indian Ocean ceased decades before the Dieppe maps were drawn. Some researchers suggest that Chinese explorers may have ventured southward, perhaps even reaching the Australian continent, and that this knowledge slowly filtered westward along trade networks, eventually finding its way onto European parchment. The maps themselves are a riot of speculation, filled with inland rivers, mountain ranges, and even notes about the inhabitants of Java la Grande, details that feel less like navigational data and more like the compiled lore of many travelers' tales. Here, in the ornate borders and vivid colors of the Dieppe maps, the entire debate is captured in miniature. They are a perfect microcosm. These charts were undeniably created in a port city, buzzing with sailors' yarns and secretive whispers, where a cartographer's workshop was a clearinghouse for the world's fragmented truths. They demonstrate how the line between hard-won discovery, informed conjecture, and inherited ancient knowledge was impossibly thin in the age of sail. A single line on the chart could be a precise bearing from a captain's log, a hopeful guess based on the flight patterns of birds, or a faded copy of a chart from a library in Alexandria. The Dieppe maps do not give us a clear answer, but they offer something perhaps more valuable, a tangible record of that moment when the known world was exploding, and every scrap of information, whether fact, fable, or fragment, was seized upon and inked into the permanent record, leaving a puzzle for us to unravel centuries later. The ornate speculation of the Dieppe maps gives way to a new kind of inquiry, one conducted not in dusty archives but in gleaming laboratories. In recent decades, our search for answers has been transformed by a suite of powerful modern tools. Satellite imaging, sophisticated computer algorithms, and advanced chemical analysis have given us a new lens through which to examine these ancient parchments. We are no longer limited to the human eye and historical conjecture. Now we can take a 15th century map and digitally stretch its distorted projection, a process called georectification, to see how its coastlines snap into alignment with the satellite view of our modern world. The results can be humbling. What looked like a prophetic outline of Antarctica might, when mathematically corrected, resolve into a recognizable, if stretched, version of a known continent like South America, effectively solving one mystery. Conversely, the process can also deepen another, revealing that a certain bay or peninsula is placed with an accuracy that feels statistically improbable for its time. This scientific scrutiny extends to the very fabric of the maps themselves. The bitter controversy over the Vinland map's authenticity is a prime example. For decades, scholars argued over medieval handwriting and obscure Latin phrases. The debate was only settled, though not to everyone's satisfaction, when particle accelerators and X-ray fluorescence spectrometers were aimed at its ink, revealing chemical compounds that hinted at a modern origin. Technology here acted as a mythbuster, applying a forensic standard to a historical claim. Yet, for every mystery it solves, modern analysis seems to uncover a new, more subtle puzzle. Consider the Portolan charts of the Mediterranean. When researchers began to analyze these sailing maps with computer precision, they made a startling observation. The charts displayed a remarkable internal consistency in their scale and proportion across vast distances. This level of accuracy implies the mapmakers possessed a method for determining east-west position, or longitude at sea. According to conventional history, this was an impossible feat before the invention of reliable marine chronometers in the 18th century. So how did medieval navigators and the cartographers who relied on their logs achieve such consistency? The technology they used, whether a complex system of dead reckoning, astronomical observations now lost to us, or some other technique, remains unexplained. This is the profound paradox of applying modern science to ancient artifacts. It does not always provide the clean answers we seek. More often, it refines our questions, stripping away layers of romantic speculation to reveal a core of genuine, inexplicable skill. The technology does not prove the existence of a lost super-civilization, but it does force a serious reconsideration of the technological and scientific capabilities of past societies. It suggests that the line of progress is not a straight, upward arrow. It is a winding path where sophisticated knowledge can be gained, applied to create something as perfect as a Portolan chart, and then lost for centuries, surviving only in the practical object itself, a silent witness to a forgotten understanding of the world. This realization shifts the mystery from what these maps show to how they were made, pulling our focus from the destinations they depict to the minds and methods of the people who drew them. The implications of these maps reach far beyond parchment and ink. If even a fraction of these anomalies represent genuine pre-Columbian knowledge, then our fundamental story of how the world was mapped begins to unravel. The celebrated age of discovery transforms in our understanding. It was likely not a miraculous, unprecedented burst of human genius and courage, though it certainly contained both. Instead, it appears more as a great rediscovery, or perhaps a ruthless commercialization, of routes and lands whose memories had never fully vanished from human awareness. The voyages of Columbus, Da Gama, and Magellan were not the first chapters of global exploration, but dramatic, well-funded middle chapters in a story that had begun millennia earlier. This perspective does not diminish their staggering achievements. Sailing into the documented unknown with the technology of their time remains a monumental feat. It does, however, recontextualize them. These explorers become less like pioneers cutting a path through virgin wilderness, and more like determined adventurers following faint, ancient trail markers overgrown by time, markers left by predecessors whose names are lost to us. This shift in view challenges a deeply ingrained Eurocentric narrative. It moves the spotlight from a single continent's sudden awakening to a global, multicultural endeavor. The world map, as it slowly came into focus, was likely a collaborative project across centuries, pieced together from the celestial navigation of Polynesian voyagers, the meticulous trade charts of Arab merchants, the imperial surveys of Chinese admirals, and the hardy coastal probes of Norse sailors. The contributions of these cultures were not peripheral footnotes, but central threads in the tapestry. History, seen through this lens, becomes less a simple chronicle of official firsts and celebrated names. It becomes something richer and more mysterious, a tapestry of interconnected, often forgotten endeavors. It reveals a world that was probably never fully or permanently isolated. Instead, pulses of contact, like intermittent signals, flickered across the oceans in the darkness between historical epochs. A ship is blown off course and makes landfall. Survivors of a storm drift on currents to a new shore. A trade network extends one link further than we thought. Each event leaves a subtle imprint, a story told in a port, a strange artifact traded, a coastline hesitantly drawn on a map that survives when its source does not. This is not a neat, linear history. It is a fragmented, recursive one where knowledge is gained, lost, and glimpsed again centuries later in the confident lines of a cartographer who no longer remembers its origin. Embracing this complexity does not simplify our past, but it does grant it a deeper, more human grandeur, woven from countless journeys, most of which we will never know. Our journey across these ancient charts brings us to a final, sweeping view from the crow's nest. We have sailed from the frozen hints of Antarctica on the Piri Reis map to the speculative shores of Java La Grande on the deep charts, traversing a sea of mysteries. These 20 cartographic anomalies do not offer a single, clear answer, but together they present a compelling case. They suggest our planet was being explored, mapped, and connected in fits and starts, in whispers and fragments, long before the year 1492. This collection of parchment and ink reminds us of a profound truth. History is most often written by the victors and the literate, by those with the power to record their story in official chronicles. Yet knowledge has other, quieter vessels. It is carried in the memories of sailors traded over a barrel of ale, in the lines on a well-worn chart passed from a retiring captain to his apprentice, and in the fragile fragments that survived the fire, the flood, and the relentless erosion of time. The true map of human exploration, therefore, is likely far more vast, intricate, and ancient than our traditional textbooks allow. It is a palimpsest, a document written over many times where the oldest writing is the hardest to see, but its faint impressions shape everything written on top. So we are left with a question that lives in the space between evidence and interpretation. Are these maps mere curiosities, the fascinating mistakes and lucky guesses of brilliant minds working with limited information? Or do they point to genuine, forgotten chapters in our shared story, pages torn from a global logbook we are only now learning how to read? The answer you find may say as much about how you see the past as it does about the maps themselves. We would love to hear your perspective. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this voyage into the unknown, be sure to subscribe for more journeys to history's hidden edges.